The intelligence officer's hands trembled as he read the report again, hoping the words would somehow rearrange themselves into a different truth. American aircraft carriers, emerging from inside mountains, not hiding near mountains or camouflaged against mountain terrain, but actually housed within the rock itself, emerging through massive doors cut into the mountainside as if the earth had given birth to warships. His superiors would think him mad, or worse, a traitor spreading defeatist propaganda designed to break Japanese morale. But the reconnaissance photographs lay before him on the wooden desk, grainy and imperfect but unmistakable in their testimony. Ships where ships could not possibly be. The year was 1945, and everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about American industrial capability, about the limits of engineering, about the very nature of warfare itself, was about to shatter like porcelain dropped from a great height. They had known the Americans were productive, certainly. They had seen the Essex-class carriers rolling out of shipyards with disturbing regularity, each one a floating city of steel and aviation fuel. But this was something different. This spoke of an industrial power so vast, so incomprehensibly organized, that it could hollow out mountains and fill them with naval warfare capability. The contradictions sat in the intelligence officer's stomach like a stone. How do you fight an enemy who builds harbors inside mountains? Have you ever discovered something that completely changed what you thought was possible? Drop a comment below and tell us about a moment when reality shattered your expectations. And if you want to journey deeper into the hidden corners of World War II history, hit that subscribe button right now, because the stories we uncover will change how you see everything you thought you knew about this war. The story begins not with the mountains themselves, but with what the Japanese High Command believed about their enemy across the Pacific. Through years of cultural education and military indoctrination, a particular image of Americans had been carefully constructed in the Japanese military consciousness. They were soft, these Americans, rich and individualistic, accustomed to comfort, lacking the spiritual discipline that made Japanese forces so formidable. They built impressive things, yes, but they lacked the warrior spirit, the willingness to sacrifice everything for victory. This belief ran deep, down to the bone, shaping every strategic calculation and tactical decision. American industrial might was acknowledged, but somehow also dismissed, as if factories and production lines were separate from the actual fighting, as if things could not translate into will. The first carrier strikes of the war had reinforced these assumptions. At Pearl Harbor, the Americans had been caught sleeping, unprepared. Their mighty Pacific fleet turned into a burning graveyard before breakfast. The early months of the war brought victory after victory for Japanese forces, conquests spreading across the Pacific like ink across paper. The Americans retreated, regrouped, seemed always to be reacting rather than acting. Their early carrier battles at Coral Sea and Midway showed courage, certainly, but also a kind of desperate improvisation that suggested limited resources, limited vision. The Japanese military leadership counted American carriers carefully, tracked each one like chess pieces on a vast oceanic board. They knew where the Lexington had been sunk, where Enterprise had been damaged, which carriers were in which theaters. This was a finite game with countable resources. But then the numbers stopped making sense. New carriers appeared faster than construction schedules should have allowed. Damaged carriers returned to service with impossible speed. Air wings that should have been scattered across the Pacific seemed to multiply, appearing in unexpected places with fresh pilots and new aircraft. At first, these discrepancies could be explained away. Perhaps American shipyard efficiency was better than estimated. Perhaps their training programs were accelerating graduation schedules. Perhaps intelligence reports had been slightly off. Small errors compounding into larger miscalculations, nothing that suggested a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's capabilities. The reconnaissance mission that changed everything had been routine, at least in its planning. American forces were advancing through the Pacific, island by island, and Japanese intelligence needed to understand the supply lines feeding this advance. A long-range reconnaissance aircraft, one of the new models with extended fuel capacity, was tasked with photographing the American West Coast naval facilities. The mission was dangerous, bordering on suicidal, requiring the aircraft to fly deep into enemy territory, but it promised intelligence valuable enough to justify the risk. The pilot was young, barely 23, a university student before the war who had studied engineering and now applied that analytical mind to the geometry of aerial photography. He understood what he was looking for: shipyards, dry docks, supply depots, the infrastructure of American naval power. What he found instead rewrote the rules of possibility. Flying along the Washington coast, his camera clicking automatically at preset intervals, he noticed something odd in the mountainous terrain near Puget Sound. The shape was wrong somehow, too regular, too geometric. At first, he thought it might be a large warehouse or aircraft hangar built against the mountain face. But as he banked for another pass, risking additional exposure to American air defenses, the scale became apparent. These were not buildings against mountains. These were openings into mountains, massive rectangular voids cut directly into the rock, and inside those voids, partially visible in the shadows, were the unmistakable silhouettes of aircraft carriers. He took 17 photographs before his fuel situation forced him to turn back toward his carrier. During the long flight home, alone with the engine's steady drone and the vast emptiness of the Pacific below, he tried to make sense of what he had seen. His engineering education provided the vocabulary but not the comprehension. To excavate chambers large enough to house carriers would require removing millions of tons of rock. The structural engineering to support such caverns, to prevent collapse, would be monumentally complex. The logistical challenge of bringing carriers into such facilities, of servicing them inside mountains, of moving the aircraft, fuel, weapons, and personnel necessary for carrier operations through mountain passages, seemed to exceed even American industrial capability. And yet the photographs in his camera told a story his mind struggled to accept. The intelligence officer who first examined those photographs experienced the same cognitive dissonance. His name was Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, though history would not remember it, and he had spent 3 years of the war tracking American naval movements with meticulous attention. He knew the American carrier fleet like a scholar knows ancient texts, each ship's construction date and combat history memorized, each captain's tactical preferences cataloged. The photographs before him suggested that his entire understanding was incomplete, that there was a shadow fleet he had never accounted for, that the Americans possessed not just more resources but a fundamentally different approach to naval warfare. Yamamoto's first instinct was to doubt the photographs themselves. Perhaps they showed something else, misidentified by an exhausted pilot under extreme stress. Perhaps they were sophisticated fakes, American propaganda intended to intimidate Japanese forces. He examined the images with a magnifying glass, looking for signs of alteration, but the grain patterns and shadow angles appeared consistent. The reconnaissance aircraft's camera equipment was reliable, its mechanical nature resistant to the wishful thinking that plagued human observation. Whatever the pilot had photographed, it was real. His second instinct was to suppress the information. If the report reached higher command and proved to be false, his career would be destroyed, his reputation shattered, his family shamed. But if the report was accurate, and he failed to pass it up the chain of command, and if that failure somehow contributed to defeat, the shame would be infinitely worse. He sat with the photographs for 3 hours, smoking cigarette after cigarette, the smoke hanging in the still air of his small office like fog, before finally drafting the intelligence summary that would send the information upward. The report traveled through layers of naval bureaucracy, each commander who read it experiencing the same shocked disbelief. Some rejected it immediately, sending back terse notes demanding verification before they would waste their superiors' time with such fantastic claims. Others sat with it longer, the way Yamamoto had, feeling the ground shift beneath their strategic assumptions. By the time the photographs reached Admiral Somu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, they had accumulated a paper trail of skeptical annotations and demands for additional reconnaissance. Toyota studied the images in silence, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. He was a veteran of naval warfare, a man who had risen through the ranks during Japan's era of naval expansion, and he understood industrial capacity in ways his more tradition-minded colleagues sometimes did not. He had visited shipyards, watched carriers under construction, understood the complexity of building and maintaining such vessels. What the photographs suggested went beyond impressive industrial capability and entered the realm of something else entirely, a vision of warfare as engineering on a geological scale. He ordered additional reconnaissance missions, knowing full well that each one risked aircraft and crews they could not afford to lose. 3 more flights were attempted. One never returned, presumably shot down by American fighters. One returned with damage and no usable photographs, the camera equipment destroyed by flak. The 3rd mission succeeded, bringing back images from a different angle that confirmed the mountain facility's existence and revealed additional details that made the scope even more staggering. The caverns appeared to have multiple levels, suggesting internal dry docks and maintenance facilities. Railway tracks ran into the mountain openings, indicating supply lines carved through the rock. The Americans had not simply hidden carriers inside mountains. They had built complete naval bases into the mountains themselves, subterranean worlds invisible from above. The psychological impact on Japanese naval command was profound and complicated. There was, first, a simple animal fear, the recognition that they were fighting an enemy with resources beyond their ability to comprehend. Every calculation they had made about production capacity, about America's ability to replace losses, about the timeline to wear down American will, suddenly seemed based on hopelessly incomplete information. If the Americans could hide entire carrier facilities inside mountains, what else remained hidden? How many more resources waited in reserve, invisible to Japanese intelligence? But beneath the fear ran something even more destabilizing, a kind of wonder that bordered on admiration. Japanese culture held deep respect for engineering accomplishment, for the transformation of natural obstacles into human achievement. The mountain carrier facilities represented exactly the kind of ambitious project that Japanese engineers dreamed about, the marriage of ancient landscape and modern military power. In another context, such an accomplishment would have been celebrated, studied, emulated. Instead, it stood as evidence of their enemy's superiority in the very domains where Japan had believed itself strong. The Americans were not just rich, they were not just productive, they were visionaries operating on a scale that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. The reality was simultaneously more mundane and more impressive than the Japanese intelligence assessment suggested. The facilities they had discovered were real, but they were not what Japanese analysts believed them to be. During the war years, the United States had indeed constructed massive underground facilities in mountainous regions, particularly in the Pacific Northwest. These facilities, born from legitimate fears about Japanese attacks on West Coast shipyards, represented one of the war's most ambitious engineering projects. But they were not complete carrier facilities capable of building and fully servicing carriers inside mountains. They were elaborate camouflage and protection schemes, ways of hiding carriers from aerial reconnaissance and protecting shipyard infrastructure from bombing. The Americans had carved enormous caverns into mountains, yes, but primarily for storage, repair facilities, and protection of industrial equipment. Carriers could be moved partially into these facilities, their distinctive profiles hidden from above, but the bulk of construction and major overhaul work still happened in traditional shipyards. The underground facilities provided what military planners called strategic depth, the ability to disperse critical infrastructure so that no single bombing raid could cripple carrier maintenance and construction. It was brilliant defensive engineering, but it was not quite the carrier-building mountains Japanese intelligence feared. Yet the Japanese misunderstanding, based on incomplete reconnaissance and the inherent limitations of aerial photography, was more important than the mundane reality. What they believed shaped their decisions, their morale, their willingness to continue fighting. The mountain carriers became a kind of psychological weapon, more powerful for being partially imagined, rumors spreading through the ranks faster than official intelligence reports. Sailors whispered about American carriers emerging from cliffs like metal dragons. Pilots spoke of bombing what they thought were mountains only to see carrier flight decks hidden beneath camouflage netting. The stories grew in the telling, each retelling adding details that made American industrial power seem more magical, more unstoppable. By late 1945, as Japan faced the dual catastrophes of atomic weapons and Soviet invasion, the mountain carrier facilities seemed almost quaint in retrospect. One more piece of evidence that the war had been unwinnable from the start. But during the months when Japanese intelligence first discovered them, when the photographs circulated through Naval Command and field commanders tried to make sense of what they meant, the psychological impact was devastating. The mountain carriers represented a truth Japanese military culture struggled to accept, that industrial capacity was a form of national will, that the Americans' material wealth translated directly into fighting power, and that Japan had underestimated its enemy in fundamental ways. There was a particular kind of shame in this realization, subtle but profound. Japanese military doctrine had emphasized spiritual strength over material advantage, the warrior's will over the industrialist's production line. Officers were taught that a determined fighter with inferior equipment could defeat a spiritually weak enemy with superior weapons. This belief was not mere propaganda, but sincere conviction, rooted in centuries of samurai tradition and decades of military philosophy. The mountain carrier facilities stood as physical refutation of this belief. The Americans had not chosen between spiritual strength and material production. They had simply built so much, so efficiently, that the choice became irrelevant. They had industrialized warfare to the point where traditional concepts of warrior virtue could not bridge the gap. Individual officers responded to this realization in different ways. Some doubled down on existing beliefs, arguing that the mountain facilities only demonstrated American cowardice, their need to hide in rocks rather than face Japanese forces in open battle. These men saw the underground bases as proof of weakness, not strength, evidence that Americans feared Japanese power so much they had to burrow into mountains like frightened animals. This interpretation allowed them to maintain their worldview intact, to continue believing that Japanese forces were spiritually superior, even as American material advantages grew overwhelming. Others absorbed the lesson more deeply, experiencing a kind of intellectual vertigo as their understanding of the war shifted. These officers began to question the propaganda they had been taught, the confident assertions about American weakness and Japanese invincibility. They looked at the mountain carrier photographs and saw not weakness but terrifying competence, an industrial civilization that could reshape geography itself to serve military objectives. Some of these men, in the war's final months, would argue for surrender earlier rather than later, recognizing that continued resistance only added to the catastrophe. Others would fight on with a kind of fatalistic determination, knowing the war was lost but unable to imagine the alternative. The mountain carriers haunted Japanese strategic planning in those final months. Every war game, every contingency plan, every calculation of force ratios had to account for the possibility that American capabilities were even greater than they appeared. If carriers could be hidden in mountains, what other resources remained invisible? How many aircraft were concealed in underground facilities? How many troops waited in reserve, unseen by reconnaissance? The uncertainty was itself a weapon, making Japanese commanders second-guess every assumption and doubt every intelligence assessment. There was poetry in the image, too, though few participants had leisure to contemplate it during the war's brutal final phase. Mountains had always been sacred in Japanese culture, homes of gods and spirits, natural fortresses representing permanence and endurance. The idea of American power literally emerging from mountains seemed almost mythological, as if the land itself fought for the enemy. Some Buddhist monks, reflecting on the war years later, would note the symbolic resonance. Japanese forces, operating from islands that would sink if conquered, facing an enemy who had fused their naval power with eternal stone. The symbolism was almost too perfect, too neat, like something from a theatrical production rather than industrial warfare. The Americans, for their part, never fully understood the psychological impact their mountain facilities had on Japanese thinking. After the war, during interrogations and historical research, Allied intelligence officers would be surprised to learn how much importance Japanese command had placed on the underground bases. To American planners, the facilities were practical solutions to practical problems, ways of protecting valuable infrastructure from potential attack. They were impressive engineering projects, certainly, but not particularly mysterious or revolutionary. The fact that Japanese intelligence had misunderstood their purpose and capabilities, had transformed them into something more threatening than they actually were, seemed almost comical in retrospect. But this gap between American intention and Japanese interpretation revealed something profound about the nature of information warfare and the psychology of conflict. What matters in war is not just what exists, but what your enemy believes exists. The mountain carrier facilities, real but misunderstood, served American strategic interests far beyond their actual military utility. They suggested an industrial capacity so vast that resistance was futile, a technological advantage so complete that even geography itself could be weaponized. The psychological advantage gained from Japanese misunderstanding was worth more than the military advantage of the actual facilities. In the decades after the war, as historians sifted through Japanese documents and interviewed surviving officers, the mountain carrier story became a footnote in larger narratives about industrial capacity and strategic miscalculation. But for the men who lived through it, who saw those reconnaissance photographs and felt their certainty crumble, the memory remained vivid. Some veterans, in interviews conducted 40 or 50 years later, could still describe the moment they first heard about carriers inside mountains, the sense of unreality, the feeling that the war had shifted into some new phase where the normal rules no longer applied. One such veteran, a radar operator named Ichiro Tanaka, described the mountain carriers as the moment he knew Japan had lost. Not when Tokyo burned, not when Okinawa fell, not even when the atomic bombs dropped. The mountain carriers were different because they represented something absolute, proof that Japan had never really understood its enemy, that the entire war had been based on fundamental misunderstanding. He spoke about this in an interview recorded in 1989, his voice soft with age but still carrying the weight of that realization. The Americans had not just been stronger than expected, they had been stronger in ways Japanese military culture could not even conceptualize until confronted with physical evidence. The mountain carrier facilities themselves were eventually declassified and opened to limited public access in the 1990 seconds. What visitors found were impressive but not magical spaces, enormous concrete, lined caverns carved into rock, equipped with rail lines and maintenance equipment, clearly designed for storing and servicing ships, but not fundamentally different from above-ground facilities except in location. The scale was remarkable, the engineering sophisticated, but standing inside them, it was hard to recapture the mythological power they had held in Japanese military imagination. They were just spaces carved from stone, lit by bare bulbs, smelling of salt water and old concrete, testimony to American industrial capability, but not supernatural in any sense. Perhaps that mundane reality is the point. The mountain carriers were never really about the facilities themselves, but about what they represented. The collision between Japanese expectations and American reality, the moment when careful propaganda and sincere belief met facts that could not be ignored. In that collision, something shifted in how Japan understood the war, understood itself, understood the nature of modern conflict. The shift was painful and slow and incomplete, but it was real. The mountain carriers, emerging from stone-like impossibilities made manifest, were simply the most vivid symbol of that transformation. The lesson echoes beyond World War II and into every conflict where assumptions about the enemy prove catastrophically wrong. Intelligence can be meticulous, yet miss fundamental truths. Cultural beliefs can blind even careful observers to realities that contradict their worldview. And sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, but the one that makes your enemy question everything they thought they knew. The Americans who carved those mountain facilities were solving practical engineering problems, but they were also, without necessarily intending it, waging psychological warfare at the deepest level. They were not just hiding carriers. They were revealing to their enemy the depth of their own ignorance. Today, those caverns stand mostly empty, occasionally toured by historians and engineering students, their military purpose long obsolete in an age of satellite reconnaissance and intercontinental missiles. But the photographs that so disturbed Japanese intelligence in 1945 remain in archives, evidence of the moment when mountains gave birth to warships and an empire's certainty shattered against the stone face of industrial reality. If you want to explore more hidden stories from the war that reshaped the world, stories of engineering marvels and human psychology, of expectations shattered and impossible truths confirmed, then subscribe and join us as we uncover the history that still waits in shadows, in archives, and yes, inside mountains.